We're now going to ask for our final speaker, Ken Cleary from the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, to address us. Ken is Principal Officer at the Department, where he's responsible for the Department's policy on climate change and related matters. And I suppose he's going to bring us almost full circle from where Paul was and talk to us a little bit about the NDP and Project Ireland 2040, and I suppose the cost of climate inaction and a strategy to help us pay for it. So Ken, without further ado, over to you. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much, Sharon. As Sharon said, I'm Ken Cleary. I'm with the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. And look, in the interest of time, and to allow us appropriate time for questions and answers, I think are always the most important of these types of sessions, I'll run through this presentation fairly quickly in the next 5 minutes. So I'll be skimming through the slides fairly fast. But as I said, please ask me questions if anything is unclear, or my email address is at the end for any detailed follow-up. Well, first of all, just for anyone who isn't aware, what is the National Development Plan? It is essentially a budget plan that the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform puts in place for the government's capital expenditure plans over the next decade. You'll see there that we're aiming for 165 billion in capital investment over this period, which is a record level of investment, but it's also going to be a record share of capital investment in the economy. We're aiming for about 5% of GNI star to be made in terms of capital investment over the next decade. And as Paul noted, obviously this expenditure is required to provide for the needs of our growing population as identified in the NPF. But really, it's absolutely critical as well that we use this expenditure to put us on the track towards an environmentally sustainable economy and to break that link that so many people have referred to this morning in terms of economic growth and greenhouse gas emissions. So what I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this morning is the climate environmental assessment that we undertook on the NDP, the decisions we made, why we made those decisions, and so on. Just to give you a flavour of some of the thinking that went on within the department and in our engagement with other departments. So first of all, why perform a climate environmental assessment? I think this is obvious to everyone here in the audience today. Not only do we now have ambitious government commitments on climate, but these are legally binding through the Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Act. And there's this need, as I said, to align public investment with the government's climate and environmental priorities. So what did we do more specifically? So as I said, the NDP sort of gives the capital ceilings to departments over the next 10 years. What it doesn't do, or what it isn't, is a blueprint for every specific policy and measure that's going to be followed in that decade. So that meant that our assessment in the NDP itself had to be qualitative in nature rather than quantitative. But what we did, the methodology we developed, was that we required every department who was putting in a proposal for funding into the National Development Plan to engage in an assessment to sort of evaluate the measures that they were contemplating against 7 broad headings, which are set out there for you. The obvious ones being climate mitigation, climate adaptation, but we also wanted to take a kind of a broader view on the environmental aspects of this investment, inspired largely, I think, by the EPA's State of the Environment report, which came out while we were in the process of undertaking this review in late 2020. So you'll see there the categories: air quality, waste and circular economy, nature and biodiversity. A lot of those are also in common with the criteria that the EU then subsequently used in their assessment of member states' recovery and resilience plans. There may be the one difference in Ireland is that we also asked departments to assess their measures against what we consider to be a just transition and the contribution to employment that's compatible with the long-term climate and environmental objectives. And this is how we asked departments to rank each of their measures against each one of those criteria that we set out on the previous page. +3, where that's sort of the programme specifically aimed at achieving a particular improvement in the outcome for this area. So if the programme is specifically geared at addressing greenhouse gas emissions, for example, it would score +3 on climate mitigation. +1, where essentially any climate environmental benefits are a side or non-specific targeted outcome of the measure in question. Neutral, if we didn't think it was likely to have any discernible impact. And then -1, where again there was risks of rebound effects or risk of negative impacts of it. And -3, where it's likely to lead to an increase in activity or encourage behaviours that would be unfavourable to some climate environmental outcomes. So again, each department would rank each of the measures against a scale for each of the criteria we set forth on the preceding page. So 128 measures in total made it into the NDP. Of these, we found that 67% of these had, on balance, a net favourable impact on climate environmental outcomes. 17% had no discernible impact, and 16% were likely to have an unfavourable impact on climate environmental outcomes. Just to give you a bit more of a flavour of what this means, I suppose, we were very clear in the process that a favourable characterisation or categorisation is not unequivocal endorsement of the programme in question. Because we're doing this on a net basis, it's possible for some programmes to still have negative climate environmental outcomes in certain areas, but where these are kind of offset by higher scores and improvements in some of the other criteria. So we're very clear that it doesn't negate the need for government departments to consider ways to address these negative environmental consequences, even within a net favourable measure. And similarly then, an unfavourable characterisation doesn't mean that it's incompatible with the achievement of our climate environmental objectives. And again, going back to Paul's presentation earlier, we need a country that can cater for 1 million extra people by 2040. That's going to need an additional 660,000 jobs, an additional 550,000 new homes constructed over that period. I think it would be dishonest of us to pretend that they can be provided in a way that doesn't lead to some negative climate and environmental outcomes in terms of the supporting infrastructure that's going to be needed for this. But at the same time, failing to provide this infrastructure is also not an option, really. So what the conclusion of measures that fall into category C are that we must work as hard as possible to ensure that we minimise the climate and environmental impacts of these investments. And where that can't be done, well, that's where we require other measures to go further in terms of mitigating greenhouse gas emissions so that we still reach those legally binding targets that the government has set. Some of the thematic characterisation, I won't go into this in detail, but I should be clear that we published a 30-page report alongside the NDP detailing this methodological process that we went through, detailing how we arrived at particular rankings for a whole host of measures included in the NDP, as you see there in front of you. To give you just a flavour of one of them, on vehicle replacement, for example, that received a positive climate environmental ranking only where it could be demonstrated that there was going to be intended that the vehicle replacement programme would have low or no emission vehicles only in that vehicle replacement programme. To get even a neutral ranking for vehicle replacement programs, departments had to demonstrate that the improvement that they anticipated in the efficiency of their vehicle fleet and hence in fuel consumption was at least 30%. That was the bar that they had to cross for a neutral assessment. Everything else then went into the negative assessment column for those kind of measures. As I said, in the interest of time, I won't go through this further, but as I said, it's all available on the department's website if you'd like to take a look. And then I suppose just to talk a little bit about then where we're going to go from here. I mentioned that the assessment in the NDP was qualitative, but at the same time, every measure that's in the NDP is also going to have to undergo a thorough quantitative assessment through what we call the Public Spending Code, which is basically the investment appraisal framework that government mandates the rest of the public sector to be used and to evaluate their investments according to. And so we've put in a full programme of work into the NDP for the updating and upgrading of this programme. We are at the moment in the process of updating the shadow price of carbon in particular, and that just means again the price of carbon that we price into investment appraisal for any increase in emissions that a project may give rise to. That's going to be adjusted and linked to the marginal abatement cost that we think will be linked to the government's achievement of the government's 2030 climate and environmental targets, particularly that minus 51% cut in greenhouse gas emissions. That's what we'll base our price of carbon on. In terms of climate adaptation, it's great to see that being talked about here, because this is an area where we feel our investment appraisal framework certainly isn't capturing enough of the climate risk and uncertainty that we need to be pricing into some of these projects. And again, we are not clear that we're fully capturing the full emissions impact of infrastructure investment, and particularly in induced demand and things like that. So we're working with the OECD and we're working with the EU Commission at the moment in terms of upgrading this framework, which we think will really make a difference to how government goes about making capital investments. And then finally, I'd just like to give you one slide on DEEPR's internal reforms, which are in progress at the moment. Why on earth am I talking to a national conference about internal reforms to government department? I think this is really interesting because I hope it'll underpin the commitment that DEEPR has to climate change. Because what we're doing is we're creating a new climate division within DEEPR that's going to draw together responsibility for all expenditure policy in certain key climate-related areas, now energy, transport, agriculture, overseas development assistance, OPW, climate adaptation will all be in one area. And that area is also then going to be responsible for the government's capital expenditure policy generally, including directly responsible for the development of any future capital investment plans like the NDP. And we're also within this unit creating new units on climate coordination and climate research. And I think why this is important and why it should be interesting to you is, again, it demonstrates the seriousness of which DEEPR takes climate change. Let me be clear, like DEEPR does not have a health division or an education division or a housing division. Neither do we have housing coordination, health coordination, or indeed health research or any research units for other areas. We are creating one for climate. That's because, I suppose, again, that's just the importance that we see that the government's climate policies and meeting the targets that have been set forth, the impact that will have on how the government goes about its business and the rest of the government's operations requires this new internal infrastructure within DEEPR to ensure that we're giving the right advice to government on this area and essentially elevating its priority within the department really quite significantly. So I'll leave it there, just to say, again, if anyone has any questions, there's my email address. But as I noted, a lot of the material in relation to NDP is available on our website, so please do take a look at that as well. Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Ken. And yeah, very interesting there, the internal reforms of DEEPR. I do think, structure matters, and I think we saw that in your presentation as well, Paul. For the delivery of these really complex, wicked problems, structure does matter. So it's very encouraging to see that being addressed in such a structured way.